Welcome to another episode of Deep Quotes. I'm D.
I'm App.
And hi, I'm Pod.
And today we have a quote from the Pope. So this should be fun, and we're going to read it here. Quote, "And I must confess to you that when I hear a speech by someone responsible for order or for a government, I think of speeches by Hitler in 1934, 1936, etc." Now, we all three, I think, have different opinions on this quote. So, App, general idea. What do you think of this quote?
I just think it's kind of ridiculous. You can't really compare a speech by anybody in government to Hitler, is kind of the way I see it.
Or specifically, you're saying that you can't compare every speech by someone from the government to Hitler. What about you, Pod?
So I definitely see it as being hyperbolic, that, the internet likes to jump to Hitler for pretty much everything.
Godwin's Law.
Yep. And in this case, you could compare any kind of powerful person to Hitler, but you're really just reaching at that point.
See, and I don't think that this is really reaching. I think that this quote is perfectly reasonable. So I think we have a good range of opinion that App thinks it's stupid.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Pod thinks it's hyperbolic, and I think it's spot on.
I really want to know why you think this is spot on now.
Okay, so let's boil it down to the concept. Again, I'll read it. "I must confess to you that when I hear a speech by someone responsible for order or for a government, I think of speeches by Hitler." What he's saying is that when someone is in a position of authority and they're speaking, with that, using that authority, you need to compare it to Hitler. I'm guessing that still sounds stupid.
Yeah.
A bit.
Okay. Why is comparing things to Hitler bad? Or specifically, why is Hitler an example that is being compared to?
So, generically speaking, when you're talking about people in government with a lot of power, Hitler is a decent enough example considering he was very totalitarian.
He used a lot of power, and he used it for what is frequently and fairly universally considered evil.
Correct.
Right. So what I think the Pope is trying to say is that when someone is in a position of power, it is very easy for that power to be abused, and we need to assume that at some point that power will be abused for the purposes of evil. Hitler did not believe that he was evil. He thought that what he was doing was good.
Mm-hmm.
And people let him get away with that for far too long, and he ended up executing more actions using his power because people let him. If we don't question those in authority, then they will continue escalating until someone speaks up against them. And we always need to keep that in the back of our minds. And I think that that's what the Pope is trying to say. Keep in the back of your mind that at some point, everyone is evil, and we need to be aware of that, especially when we give people power.
And I think that's fair. I think part of the reason why I consider it to be hyperbolic is not everyone is going to use that power for that level of evil, and not everyone even has that amount of power that he's talking about here.
Exactly.
I would partially disagree with that not everyone has that degree of power. How much power does a government, how much backing does any action by the government have?
Typically the military, which is pretty big.
If I steal a postage stamp, are they going to send the military after me?
Well, no. It's just a postage stamp.
Okay, but I steal the postage stamp, they know about it, and they want to fine me for it. They're going to fine me $5 for it. What if I say no?
Well, then they're just going to keep coming after you. You don't really get to escape them.
Okay, well, what do you mean by coming after me? What would happen if I refuse to pay that $5?
Well, it's going to go to collections. Depending on what the infraction is, the postage stamp, they're probably not going to go as far as sending you to jail, but...
Well, okay, but I have a fine out. I have to pay a fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What if I don't pay the fine?
I mean, you're going to get interest on it. It's going to keep growing.
Okay. So now let's say that interest keeps growing over a couple of years or something, and now I owe $1,000.
Well, you probably won't actually owe $1,000 for a postage stamp. You're more likely to just run into problems if you try to do something, like if you
Get a passport or something like that.
Okay, so
You're
now...
probably not going to just show up at the house and be like, you owe us a fine for this old postage stamp that you stole.
Okay, but the interest will continue to grow. Collections will continue to get more and more upset to the point where they're going to try and collect the money.
Eventually.
And one of the things
Yeah.
that the government will try to do is just garnish wages. Okay, what if I refuse to let that happen? And I say, no, I'm not letting you withhold wages. I am not paying that money. I'm not paying that fine.
I wish you luck,
Why?
because most of the time the wage garnishment, it goes to your employer and you don't really know about it.
And if I interfere with that and make sure that they're not taking my wages, that could be getting into the idea of tax fraud.
Yep.
Okay,
Or
Send
so
him
you would
to a
just
bigger
lose
hole.
your job.
Or I'm
because
losing
your-
my
Your
job.
employer would say, we're not dealing with this. We would like to garnish your wages because the government is on our backs.
and if the employer says that they're not going to garnish the wages or not permit that to happen,
Well, then the government's going after the employer too.
they're going after the employer. They're going after me as well. Eventually, at some point, it's probably going to escalate to the point where police go to the house and say, look, you owe this money. Could it escalate to the point of being under arrest?
Perhaps.
If not for a postage stamp, something more substantial. You tried to steal $50 from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Eventually, if you don't pay a fine for long enough, there can be a warrant out for your arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be arrested. What if I resist arrest?
Well, then you're really going to jail.
And by the way, I'm building up to a point here of if I continuously refuse to pay, and they're arresting me for refusing to pay, the cop is going to have a firearm on him, right? And the reason that's there is because if I'm trying to resist, or if I don't let him into my home, because no, I'm not permitting you entry, because I don't believe that the charge that's against me is right, or regardless of that, he eventually has the right to escalate to using his gun or using force against me. And if I continue to resist that, he can use his gun, or if I continue to barricade my house, the SWAT team or military can be sent into my home.
Yes.
Do you agree with that escalation? Despite the fact that it would take a very long time and is very unlikely, because at some point I'll be like, okay, I'll pay the $100.
Mm-hmm. Or at some point, some judge somewhere is just going to throw it out and be like, we
But
could go after this, but this is stupid.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But there is the potential, particularly for more serious crimes that do just say, yeah, you have a warrant out for your arrest. If you start resisting that, that's when guns can start to be involved. What I'm trying to say is that any action that is taken that is viewed as illegal by the government, or if there's any order by the government that you decide to disagree with and act against, it eventually can come down to the point of a gun. Do you agree with that? Based on how I laid it out there, I realize it took a long time to get to that point.
I can see a lot of things coming to that point.
To the point of a gun.
Yeah.
And taxes are the same thing. That if you don't pay your taxes, you're eventually going to get arrested. Or if you pay your taxes incorrectly, you're going to get arrested. And if you disagree with that, or even once you do get arrested, you're put in prison, which is protected by guns, which means lethal force. So anything that the government legislates has lethal backing to it. Regardless of how minute or mundane it seems, if you can be charged legally for it and put in prison eventually for it or put in jail, you are being held at gunpoint to not leave.
But I mean, by that same token, the government is holding itself at gunpoint as well, right? If, say, some person in political power right now came out and signed some order that,
Then
I don't know, we're
they're
gonna
at the same
round
risk.
up people.
They're at the same risk, but they have power in that government to help avoid the legal consequences, or they can change the laws to make it legal for them to do what they want to do, which is what Hitler did. Since
But
he
I mean,
had the
that's-
power, he's like, I'm going to make myself chancellor to give myself more power to make it legal for me to abuse the power.
But I mean, that's a core distinction between the German government at that time and the U.S. government, at least if we're talking about the United States, that we have the multiple branches of government and they hold each other accountable. If one branch of government goes off the rails and decides that it wants to do something bad, it can only go so far before the other two branches pull them back and say, no, get back in line.
Ideally, but for instance, with if the president is taking executive action, a lot of times there's maybe a cool-off period, but the president can go to war as long as it's less than 60 days. before getting congressional approval. That's a lot of power to have at one person's discretion. So would you agree that if I'm the president and I can choose to go to war for whatever reason I want for 60 days, even if during those 60 days, after it, I know that I'm going to be getting kicked out of office, I can technically do it legally. I can do a lot of damage in that time.
So you
Absolutely.
could, but if you're talking about military power, you also have the fact that military personnel are able to go against direct orders if they know that they are being ordered to do something illegal.
But
Yes,
it gets
but
a little bit more interesting because in a lot of ways you get brainwashed in the military to just follow those orders.
it's not even that. And I'm going to bring up a reference to a book called Ordinary Men. For those of you that haven't read it, it talks about actually Nazis, specifically the Nazi occupation of Poland, and how ordinary Polish policemen during the occupation were now under the rule of German government, and they basically said, hey, you're going to go out into this field and kill all these Jews. They told them how to do it. They instructed them how to do it. And they also said, if you don't want to do this, we'll put you on other duties. They didn't force these police officers to do any killing. The police officers followed through with it voluntarily because they were afraid of peer pressure. They were afraid that if they stood up against their superiors, even though there were 20, 30, 40 of these police officers, they were being told, go kill these people. They felt that if they spoke up, even though it was okay that they were told by their superiors, you don't have to do this. They felt that if they were the one to speak up, that they would be letting down their comrades. I think that, sure, you would expect people to do good and speak up in those types of circumstances. As we've seen, particularly in Nazi Germany, they don't. And I think that's, again, one person can bring, given enough power, can bring a huge amount of evil into the world, particularly because it's very difficult to detect when an action is evil. When you're used to following orders from all of your superiors, because you assume that there's a higher cause, and it's like, look, I need to just follow my leg of, or support my portion of this, even though I don't know why it's happening or what the overarching goal is. If you don't know that, you can justify pretty much anything, particularly when you're used to using lethal force against people. Which is why I'm saying that when you hear someone speaking in government, they have the backing of a gun at some point. And particularly as you go higher and higher up, whenever the president speaks, you need to keep in mind that he has an absurd amount of power. The U.S. president, he has an absurd amount of power and has the potential to use it. And there's a decent likelihood that even the military will follow through on that, assuming that there is a greater cause for good, which is what the Nazis believed. They thought they were doing good. So based on that, I think that that's my justification for why the Pope was saying that we need to compare everything that leadership says or government says and compare it to what Hitler was saying, because Hitler thought he was doing good. So does our government. And so we need to assume that regardless of motive, that this action may be evil and that it does have the backing of a gun, and we need to be very careful with how that power is used.
And I can understand that, especially with what we've seen today, where even in the U.S., where in theory we have checks and balances, they aren't necessarily working the way that everybody expects them to work. Because, you know, if you have both the executive branch and a lot of folks in Congress, things get a little bit weird. And I can totally understand where the Pope is coming from with saying, look, take everything that a leader says with a grain of salt, because it may not be exactly what you're hearing.
And I think that that's probably a better version of this quote, is take everything that you hear with a grain of salt, particularly from leadership. And he's giving a hyperbolic, like you said, Pod, it's a hyperbolic example of comparing to Hitler, but I think we should compare the potential to what can be considered a great evil.
Yeah. I mean, I still think it's hyperbolic, at least from the perspective of, like, not everything that a government official says needs to be put through that same filter. Right?
That's a good point.
But it should always be in the back of our minds.
It should be in the back of our minds, but it shouldn't be the first thing you think about anytime a government official is giving any kind of speech. You're like, oh, we're going to reduce emissions. How is that Hitler?
Sure. But I think I would contend that the more grandeur or grandiose the change, so the bigger the change that's being implemented, the more we should consider, Hitler changed things really quickly. How could this be poorly looked at in the future?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. Anything else that we want to add to this topic?
Nope. I think we covered
I
it.
think we're good.
Sounds good. Then I'll just again read the quote one more time. Quote, "And I must confess to you that when I hear a speech by someone responsible for order or for a government, I think of speeches by Hitler." And that was from the Pope. So that's all for this episode. Thanks for listening.